I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Kate McMahon, who is now the museum specialist with the Center for the Study of Global Slavery with the Smithsonian Institute. I hope you pardon me for reading this, as I don't want to stumble over my words, and I'm sure you don't want me to either. Dr. McMahon was born and raised in Maine. She attended the University of Southern Maine for both her bachelor's and master's degrees and completed her PhD in history at Howard University. Dr. McMahon was exploring the complexities of Northern New England and their connections to a slave trade. Her interest in this brought her here to this museum to do some additional research, as Vassalboro was one of the many Maine locations that had safe houses for slaves, and one of the notable houses in Vassalboro was the Farwell House on Riverside Drive, whose owner, Ebenezer Farwell, was an actual slave trader. Russell Smith and I were on duty when Dr. McMahon visited this establishment to do research a few years ago. I, in my ignorance, thought she was a student working on a paper for a college course, not realizing she had already earned her doctorate degree and was affiliated with the Smithsonian Institute. How fortunate we are that she crossed our threshold for her research. When the Society's board of directors were trying to come up with programs to present to the public, she topped our list of possibilities. I contacted her and we were able to come up with a time that she would be available to present a program. Then COVID reared its ugly head and we had to postpone. When we were finally able to present programs to the public again, Dr. McMahon was then with child and delivered the little girl on July 4th of 2022. Just carries history a little too far, don't you think? So we postponed it once again. We tried scheduling one more time, and lo and behold, please let us welcome Dr. Kate McMahon.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jan, and everyone from the Vassalboro Historical Society. I'm going to do my best to project and talk loudly. I know this is a little difficult to see if you're in the way back. So this is being recorded in high definition on my computer, and the Vassalboro Historical Society is going to put it up online somewhere soon. And I can also send out a PDF of the slideshow before that if you're all unable to see the slides. I'll do my best to describe them though. So as Simone said, my name is Kate McMahon, and I'm this historian of global slavery at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And oh yeah, please do. It's the big ring closest to the lens.
Oh. All right, there we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And so in my role at the Smithsonian, I work on a couple of major projects. One of them, hopefully some of you might be able to come to DC and see soon. We are opening a new exhibition on global slavery in December 2024 called In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World. And it's all about the ways in which global slavery touched the place that we live in, and that is every continent on earth. So as global slavery, I'll just give you some brief background about the slave trade. The slave trade really emerges in a pivotal moment in global history. We basically have the convergence of a number of different things that set in motion the global slave trade. So slavery really had existed for millennia in different forms, but what came out of the transoceanic slave trade was something wholly new, a whole new system of enslavement that continued to shape our world throughout the period of slavery and continues to shape our world today in various ways. So slavery touched nearly every continent on earth in one way or another. The empires that were built by enslavement continue to shape the places that we live and work today. The trade was driven by waterways, rivers, were transportation, oceans were transportation. And what happens in around 1400, 1450 is the emergence of technological advancements related to navigation, shipbuilding that allowed a much further ocean travel than humans had ever been known to be able to do before. So it wasn't until after about 1400 that Europeans were able to get to the west coast of Africa in large numbers through the sea. Previous work obviously had been done. They had been going land routes and other routes mixed through the Mediterranean, but this was the first time really that humans have been able to, in large numbers, take large ships to the west coast of Africa. And of course, at the same time is when the European colonizers began to take the Americas and colonize the Americas. So at this moment, we have the convergence of these two major monumental periods in human history. And as the Americas continued to be colonized and worked, and the plantation economies that became to dominate the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries began to emerge, there begins a massive desire on the European part for human labor. And the cheapest labor after indigenous peoples had died from war or disease or famine was to go to Africa. And so that begins to shape what we see. Slavery becomes racialized during this process. So slavery was not something that was determined by race until around 1600. So that is happening throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. Prior to that, it was not something specifically for people with Black skin or a specific skin color. Often it was determined by ethnicity, religion, those sorts of things, rather than by your skin color. So, of course, this means that about what the number that we know is about 12.5 million people were embarked in Africa to go aboard the transoceanic slave trade. About 10.7 million people survived the Middle Passage. So that means there was a mortality rate of about 15% of all people who stepped aboard a ship in Africa died during that Middle Passage, from disease, from malnutrition, or dehydration and no water, from shipwrecks, from violence. So this had an immense human toll that really shaped the continent of Africa and continues to shape the continent of Africa today. One particular reason is that almost for every 2 men that were taken out of Africa, only 1 woman was taken out of Africa. And so this, of course, causes a massive gender imbalance when young women are looking to marry. It causes all kinds of different destabilizations related to labor and production and agriculture and home life. And of course, the human impacts of losing family and friends and kinship and your identities. So this had a massive role in our human history. And of course, we did have slavery in the state of Maine, or the District of Maine, until Maine separated in 1820. Slavery in Maine was relatively, in comparison to the southern states, small, but that doesn't mean it was any less inhumane or brutal. This document here on the left is in the Maine Historical Society. It is the will of William Pepperell, who was one of the largest enslavers in the state of Maine. He owned dozens of enslaved people in southern York County, and was probably the largest single slave trader from the state of Maine that we know of, at least right now. He brought significant numbers of enslaved people between his plantations in Antigua and Barbados to Maine. And this quote here on the right-hand side is from a different document that's in the Maine Historical Society, and it says, "Sir, I received yours by Captain Morris with bills of lading for 5 Negroes and 1 hogshead of rum. 1 Negro woman marked Y on the left breast died in about 3 weeks after her arrival in spite of medical aid which I procured. All the rest died at sea. I am sorry for your loss. It may have resulted in deficient clothing so early in the spring. Benjamin Bullard to Sir William Pepperell, June 25th, 1719. And Bullard is not talking about the emotional loss, the loss of life. He's talking about Pepperell's financial loss, that these people died as a result of basically freezing to death because they did not have clothing and they were exposed to the elements aboard the vessels. So I think it drives home that slavery here was just as brutal and awful and shaped the place that we live in today, just as much as any other southern state or anywhere else in the world. So we did have a legal slave trade here in the state of Maine. We don't know a lot about it, oddly enough, and there's several reasons why, which I'll get to in a moment. We do know that there was a colonial market for enslaved people in the town of York by 1650. We only have a relatively small amount of evidence for Maine's role in the slave trade directly to Africa prior to 1800. To give a little bit of background, prior to the American Revolution, Massachusetts citizens, of course, which Mainers were at that time, had made 2 attempts to stop the trade in enslaved Africans, but these were not favored by the colonial governor of Massachusetts, and therefore they went nowhere. Rhode Island and Connecticut did pass resolutions barring the importation of enslaved Africans into their borders, but none of these colonial powers made any attempts at limiting the engagement of their citizens in the traffic in enslaved Africans elsewhere. So trading enslaved Africans between Africa and the Caribbean, for example. It was not until 1787 that Rhode Island passed the first law in New England barring the trade in enslaved people by its citizens, which levied a 1,000 pound fine for fitting out the vessel and an additional 100 pounds per captive. Massachusetts and Connecticut followed with similar legislation in 1788. However, as Elizabeth Donnan, a scholar who wrote about the law and slavery in the early 20th century, wrote, quote, "The legislative situation was confused by questions of jurisdiction and constitutionality, all of which tended to aid the slave trader and to increase the zeal of the abolitionists for federal rather than state action." So people in Maine really wanted to, and Massachusetts really wanted the federal government to take action because there was a real lack of consistent legislation, prosecution, fines, that sort of thing. So we do know several vessels that landed in Maine, what would become Maine, prior to 1800. The most famous is this quote here, the Betsy, which arrived in 1752 and was captained by Samuel Lamphere, who landed the vessel in Kittery with an unknown, it just says a quantity of very likely boys and girls of the blackest sort. All persons who incline to be purchasers may apply to me, the subscriber, where they shall be dealt with on reasonable terms. And this was advertised in the local newspaper. We also know of several other vessels here on the right-hand side, the Snon Knutsford from Berwick, the ship Hereford from Sheepscot River, and the Rising Sun from Biddeford, were one set of vessels that we know of, but there's likely many more. And we have a few reasons for the reason why we have trouble assessing Maine's role in the slave trade. Number one is there's been a lack of research. It's not been something that scholars and historians or amateur historians have really looked at in a significant way. So that is a major reason, but new work is happening at the grassroots community level up to scholars who are taking up this work across the region. And hopefully in the next 10 years, we'll know a lot more because of that. There's also a misunderstanding of what the slave trade was. We tend to think that there were slave ships and merchant ships, and that they can't be both. But the reality is that most slave ships also acted as merchant ships at different times. So to say there's a slave ship and a merchant ship is really, it's not accurate. They tended to be the same vessel, and often at the same time that the ships were carrying enslaved people, they might be carrying other legitimate cargo. So this confuses the way that people look at maritime history, and they don't dig deeply enough into a ship's every single voyage, and miss that the merchants and the captains and the seamen involved were engaging in this activity as well. And a third problem is that we have a lot of unaccessed archives in the state of Maine. We have a lot of small rural historical societies who don't have the funding and the capacity to scan documents, to properly catalog things so that people could find stuff. It's a lot of work, and it's a huge expense. And hopefully, you know, there's new grants, there's new things happening, like what's happening here at Vassalboro Historical Society with all the work that they've been doing the last couple of years. So hopefully that will begin to change as more stuff gets up online and more researchers can find those things. And then finally, there's also a lack of support in institutions of higher education in the state of Maine for this type of research. There's just nowhere that you can really go to study this research. That's why I moved to Washington, D.C. to do it myself 11 years ago. So hopefully that will also change at some point soon too. So briefly, I will touch on the domestic slave trade. The domestic slave trade is the slave trade within the United States. So when you hear of people being sold from the upper South to the lower South, from Baltimore to New Orleans, for example, that was the domestic American slave trade. That was Americans trading other African American enslaved people. So that this was a legal slave trade that persisted all the way up until the Civil War, when, you know, essentially 1863, January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. So we do know that there were a number of merchants engaged in the domestic American slave trade. These are two ship manifests for two different vessels owned by Rufus Soule of Freeport. Rufus was considered one of the founding fathers of Freeport, well-loved. He's one of these, you know, built very historic, beloved figures. And yet I just scratched the surface and discovered that he was trading enslaved people on the very same vessels that he was trading cotton and sugar. So this is for the vessel on the left is for the brig Venus. And aboard the brig Venus, during this one journey, he transported an young enslaved woman of 15 years named Mary from Charleston to New Orleans. And this on the right-hand side is for the brig Susan Soule, which was named after Rufus's wife, where he traded Caroline and her two children, 6-year-old Harry and 1-year-old Godfrey, from their home near Baltimore all the way to New Orleans. So this was devastating, family shattering, you know, life altering to be ripped away from your family and sold. You know, it might as well has been on the moon. It's another area in which we are actively researching to identify other instances of things like this. So what I focus on and what I'm interested in, and will be the subject of my talk tonight, is the illegal slave trade. In 1807, Great Britain abolished the slave trade, the participation of its citizens in the slave trade. And in 1808, with considerable diplomatic pressure from Great Britain, the United States followed suit. And so any slave trading done outside of the United States, whether that was American citizens transporting enslaved people to the Caribbean or to South America, anything like that was illegal. And it was also legal for them to, of course, bring enslaved Africans into the United States, but they could still continue to trade African Americans and did so again up until the Civil War. Very few ships that we know of landed in the mainland United States proper. There are a few famous ones you may have seen on the news recently about the Clotilda in Mobile, Alabama, which was a shipwreck that was recently discovered by some colleagues of mine. We are currently, actually, my team at the museum is currently working with the descendant community there in Africatown, Alabama, where the descendants of the enslaved aboard that vessel live. And actually the man who built that vessel, his name was Timothy Mayer, and he and his brother were from Whitefield, Maine, and had moved down to Mobile in order to start a steamship building company. And he basically believed that he could smuggle enslaved Africans from Benin into Mobile without being caught by the Union Army, and bet another Confederate that he could do so. And he did so. And was successful in landing these people and bringing them to his sugar plantation. So obviously Maine has a lot of ties to this everywhere, but there are relatively few vessels like this, cases like this, where enslaved Africans were brought to the mainland United States. Rather, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of instances of American vessels transporting enslaved Africans to other places during the period of the illegal slave trade. And there's a few reasons why. I'll just briefly sketch them here. American ports had navies and police and all those sorts of things, U.S. Marshals. And so therefore it would have been a lot more difficult for them to land a ship in that kind of environment. And of course, the taxes, that's the biggest thing, is that they had to pay taxes and tariffs in order to do this. And therefore they would not have been able to as easily evade authorities as they would have if they worked outside of the United States. And of course, enslaved Africans would have spoken, if they came from Africa, would not have spoken English or would have had an accent, and therefore they would have been brought suspicion about for the enslaver at auction. And finally, after 1820, the United States made this an act of piracy. So it became punishable by death. It was a capital offense until after 1820. I'll talk a little bit more about this tonight, but unfortunately, or I guess depending upon your opinion of the death penalty, only one person was ever hung for participation in the illegal slave trade, and that was Nathaniel Gordon from Portland, Maine, who was hung in 1862. But that was a real politically motivated moment. It was a grandstand by Abraham Lincoln and his advisors in order to really put a stop to the slave trade. And it was, of course, also part of the lead up to the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a lot happening in that moment. And it was an embarrassment politically for Lincoln, of course, that American citizens from the North are participating in a foreign slave trade while Lincoln is trying to end American slavery. So there's a lot of political reasoning behind why Gordon was hung. But over the scope of the 60 or so years that the illegal slave trade in the United States was in operation, very few people suffered any real consequences. They paid fines and maybe did a few days, weeks, maybe a few months of jail time. And so for the most part, people were acquitted, pardoned, or paid their fine, which was a fraction of the amount of money they actually made by participating in the slave trade. So now why we're all here tonight, Ebenezer Farwell. So Ebenezer was born here in Vassalboro, and he was the son of Ebenezer Sr., who lived at Riverview House in Vassalboro, which is just adjacent to his house, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And he was a ship captain, and in 1838, he captained a vessel called the Transit. The Transit was built in 1829 by Johnson Williams Builder in Bath. It was launched in 1832 and had a carrying capacity of 199 tons of cargo. In 1838, Farwell took the vessel to the border of Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, on the west coast of Africa, and returned to the port of New York City with 3 enslaved Africans on board. A 4th enslaved man named Yazee was left here in Vassalboro with his father at Riverview House. He left him as a, quote, indentured servant. So he was, according to Farwell, legally free, but he had a period of indenturement to Farwell's father. Farwell was charged with breaking the 1818 and 1820 laws prohibiting the slave trade. And I can read more about what happened here. So these are some newspaper articles. On the left, quote, our readers remember that Captain Farwell of the ship Transit was some time ago arrested on the charge of having kidnapped 4 Africans on the coast of Africa with intent to make them slaves. 3 of the Africans had been perfectly at liberty in this city, New York, since their arrival here, and the 4th had been at work on the farm of Captain Farwell's father in Maine. And then again, in 1838, on the 23rd of August, 1838, the ship Transit imported from Africa into the port of New York a Negro boy named Ganger. The vessel was seized under the first section of the Act of the 20th of April, 1818. On September 8th of that year, the libel was dismissed with a certificate of probable cause or seizure. So what does that mean? Well, let's see if my slide will advance. There we go. So what happened in New York was that a Black abolitionist here at the center, his name was David Ruggles, found out about the 3 enslaved Africans in New York City. Ruggles had heard that there were these men had been smuggled in, and they were very afraid. And so he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was a major Black abolitionist in the city of New York, rather. And so he activated a network of other free Black sailors and people who lived near the docks to save these 3 men from the Transit. And they found out about Yazee, who was here in Vassalboro. And Farwell was arrested and quickly brought up on charges. But as I said in the previous slide, this really went nowhere, which was frustrating given the amount of evidence. But this is a newspaper article that says what happened next. So, quote, in order to disprove the allegation that he intended to sell these men as slaves, Captain Farwell produced 2 papers, one of which was an agreement he made with 3 of these Africans, and the other a separate agreement with Yazee to pay them and him so much per month for their services in assisting to navigate the ship from Africa to New York. An attempt was made to discredit these statements, and Mr. Ruggles, seen here, and another colored man named Slauson deposed that they were acquainted with the handwriting of the man named Hughes, now in Africa, whose name is subscribed as a witness to the agreement made with the Africans, and that they did not believe it was his handwriting. Judge Betts decided that the law prohibiting the bringing of native Africans to the U.S. did not prohibit the bringing of men free here to do involuntary labor. The court discharged the complaint on the ground that the labor must be involuntary or what is tantamount to slavery, or does not come within the provision of the law. That was from the Hartford Daily Current, September 8th, 1838. So essentially, the court found that because Farwell presented these almost certainly bogus manumission papers, that these men were technically free, and that that Farwell was innocent. Thankfully, the court did demand that they be allowed to go back to Liberia, and so Yazee was taken the following year in 1839 back to Liberia somehow. So Farwell comes back and starts construction on his beautiful Greek Revival house. And he, of course, it's this big grand house, which, you know, sitting next to his father's is quite the contrast. And he's acquitted, and he decides to build this large house, but he runs out of money. So he decides to go back to Africa, and he captains a Plymouth schooner named the Mary Carver. So the Mary Carver was built in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and it was a relatively moderate schooner at 185 tons. And it went exactly back to the same spot where Farwell had purchased Yazee and the other 3 enslaved men who he brought to New York, which was at the border between Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. So he goes back, and what happens next is a matter of debate, depending upon whose perspective that you believe. So from here, we have the perspective of the newspapers, we have the perspective of the American Navy and the American naval officers involved, and then we have the perspective of the Africans. So for me, I suppose you could come to your own decision about what you think happened next. So I'll read this newspaper article that a correspondent of the Boston Courier at Castine writes that Captain Robert Farwell, well, they misnamed him in this, Captain Farwell was sailing master of the schooner Mary Carver and was supposed to have been murdered with the rest of the crew on the coast of Africa. Letters dated March 26 were received from him by the same mail that brought news of his murder on the 20th of April. So, and then it continues, Captain Farwell's residence is in Vassalboro in this county where his afflicted father resides. His wife is the daughter of Joseph R. Abbott, Esquire of this town. His connections are highly respectable, and the shocking catastrophe carried deep affliction to an extensive circle of relations and friends. So Farwell is killed in Liberia. And really, we don't fully understand what happened. We'll never know exactly what happened, but what I have been able to surmise is that they were killed in Liberia by members of a ethnic group called the Berebere, identified as the Krakow tribe, spelling obviously we're unsure about. There's multiple versions of it. But this was almost certainly a slave trading deal gone bad. That's where you begin to read through the lines as you look at all of this evidence and all of the accounts. And this was almost certainly he had returned to the same spot to purchase captive Africans, and something went wrong. And so retribution by the United States government was swift and brutal. The USS Saratoga, which is this vessel here, had just been constructed. In 1842, it was built at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. This is the first vessel built by the American Navy to look for Americans engaged in the slave trade. So between 1808 and 1842, there had been no vessel specifically being used to look for people engaged in the slave trade. And that was important because slave trading vessels were fast. And that, I mean, of course, you're doing something illegal, just like anyone doing anything illegal today. You want a fast getaway vehicle, right? You want something that maneuvers well. So these folks at this point between 1808 and about 1855 were using pretty small vessels, and they had a real liking for vessels from Maine. And so what I've discovered is that, in fact, Maine built and Massachusetts built vessels are the #1 vessels engaged in the American illegal slave trade. So we have cornered the market, and that is because our ships are the best built. We have the best wood. We have the best technology. Our ships are the fastest. And of course, you want a Ferrari for your getaway vehicle. And so that's what these folks were choosing. Yeah.
So the Navy would have had to make the determination that this was worthy of retribution to destroy these villages. And so there wouldn't have been an investigation to see if it was slave trade related, if there were other jobs.
Well, I'll get into that. Yeah. So, and they didn't care if it was slave trading. So essentially, American vessels were, Maine vessels were the #1 vessels that were preferred during this time period. And so the USS Saratoga is the first vessel built to look for Americans engaged in the slave trade. And the first thing that this vessel is commissioned to do is to go to Liberia and find out what happened to Farwell and the crew on board this vessel. So what we have here in the middle is an account by one of the sailors. And they did indeed investigate what happened. I'll read the account, one of the accounts in a second, by one of the British naval officers, Commodore Perry. But essentially what they did not have a motivation to decide whether or not it was related to slave trading. And in fact, it seems, were not particularly interested in the Farwell case other than for a reason to go and force this group of people living on this part of Liberia, which is very close to Cape Palmas, which was the American colony in Liberia, into trade relationships. These people were considered to be warriors, and they were stopping trade from going up and down the coast clearly. So the Americans, there's hundreds of pages related to the American naval work here. And they are primarily interested in facing this particular group in order to force them into trade, which is of course something armies have been doing, especially during that period for a long time. So this is what one of the sailors aboard this document here is actually in the Maine Historical Society. It's a diary of one of the sailors on board the USS Saratoga. Actually, probably one of the people in this picture. We don't know the names of these sailors in this picture, but this was taken right as the vessel launched, as well as this picture. And it says, "As I was behind the line, I could move about pretty freely and soon became possessed of a very strong desire to shoot somebody, but could not see a shot sufficiently certain to expend my charge on, knowing that before I could load again, they would be too far off to hit. So I ran towards the natives, escaping on our left, but seeing two in the water, it appeared a most beautiful chance, and I went to give it to them. I could have loaded and fired frequently, for no matter how deep they dived, they would have to come to the surface again to blow. The purser also came along with the intent to kill, and we were just drawing bead on them when we learned that they were crewmen from the Macedonian, which was another U.S. Navy ship, and had taken to the water so that they might be mistaken for natives. We spared them and afterwards kept others from shooting them." So from there, the accounts, this is of course where the accounts diverge. So they raised between 50 and 100 villages. And what they discovered in the course of this, and didn't disagree with, is that the men who were the perpetrators, who had actually killed Farwell and the crew, had died in the interim, and they were no longer in the area. And yet something like this happens. Krakow, who was the head of the tribe, being required, he was the chief, being required to state what he had to say in extenuation of his guilt for the murder of Captain Farwell, with great boldness said it was true Captain Farwell had been executed at this town, that his life had been forfeited by his own rash conduct. Said that Captain Farwell had murdered two of his Krakows boys who had been sent on board his vessel to deliver a lot of goods, just goods, what goods, which Captain Farwell had left with him for sale, but on account of their inferior quality, he had not been able to dispose of them. Said Captain Farwell refused to receive the goods, became infuriated, and finally murdered the boys. He disclaimed having seized the vessel, and she drifted on shore, bilged, and sunk with everything in her. He was a little puzzled here how to account for the crew, and came to a dead halt. It was too apparent that he intended to lie himself out of the whole affair. Commodore Perry, discovering such was the case, remarked to Krakow that he wanted no more of his lies, and in an undertone ordered Lieutenant Conti to bring up a guard of Marines. Whether this was heard or not is uncertain, but a moment afterwards, one of the kings made a movement to the rear and passed out of the Palaver house. As he gained the rear of the tent and within a few paces of a party of natives, he threw up his hands, when immediately a gun was discharged by one of his party, and simultaneously the king and his interpreter rushed out of the Palaver house when a general melee took place. Commodore Perry seized the king by his gown as he attempted to escape, which giving way, he grappled with him, seizing a cloth fastened around his loins, and in the struggle fell and was dragged some 15 or 20 yards through the sand, when a sailor by a blow over his head with the butt end of his musket brought the king to the ground. He received almost the same moment several bayonet stabs, but for the stern interposition of the Commodore's authority would no doubt have been killed on the spot. The interpreter, in running within a few paces of the palisade, was shot dead through the back by Captain Tatnall. So they murdered the king in a peaceful palaver. And unfortunately, that was the end of the Krakow tribe. From what it seems, that ethnic group was essentially scattered after this event, and Farwell's vessel and Farwell and his crew stayed at the bottom of the river. And that was all that came out of that. And I do know that after his death, his wife never really lived in the house. And I think for a time she lived with her father-in-law, and then eventually went back to live with other family members. And his sons were actually adopted, I think, by her father, and brought up in Augusta. So, you know, obviously this had huge impacts here in this town for the people that lived here, but also, you know, had huge impacts in Liberia. And it's a deep connection that is felt through a lot of these places that were touched by the slave trade. And the Vassalboro is in no way alone in this economy. Maine ships transported, just between 1850 and 1865, at least 20,000 enslaved people to Cuba. The average profits for a slave ship fleet, for the slave ship, was about $3.1 million in today's money, just for the owners after all expenses, that was coming back to the state of Maine. So if you think about that, and what that could mean for someone, it's not a surprise that they took this type of risk, that this would, in many cases, the vessels sunk immediately. They were sunk on purpose. They were raised. These were brand new, perfectly sound vessels that they sunk because they made so much money. They could view the vessels as disposable. And it ends up being a huge amount of money, obviously coming back into our economy. The value of Maine's timber industry in 1852 was estimated by the state at about $2.5 million in 1852 dollars. And our slave ship fleet was valued at $11 million. So that means our slave ship fleet per year is bringing back almost 4 times as much money into our state's economy than the timber industry. And the timber industry is, of course, also going into the slave ship fleet in some way. So we have an economic system that is much more deeply tied to slavery and the slave trade over a much longer period than we have ever really considered. I think in Northern New England, we always think of ourselves as an abolitionist haven, the Underground Railroad. That's what we want to think to ourselves as our identity, but in reality, it's much more complicated than that. But I think one thing to really consider is the fact that these African people really resisted their situation. I mean, the David Ruggles and the enslaved Africans in New York helped to save Yazee, number one, who likely would have been here until he died. And they also, pushed for the emancipation of scores more and helped to protect other Africans that were being brought illegally into the port of New York City. But of course, this is a horrific, inhumane situation, and one that should not be forgotten about. And, we have these newspaper articles that speak a little bit about just how deeply invested our state and our region was in the slave trade. And I'll just read the second one. Under such circumstances, it might well be supposed that the slave trade would in practice be extinguished, that virtuous men would by their abhorrence stay its polluted march, and wicked men would be overawed by its potent punishment. But unfortunately, the case is far from otherwise. We have but too many melancholy proofs from unquestionable sources that it is still carried on with some amicable ferocity and insatiable rapacity of former times. Avarice has grown more subtle in its evasions, and watches and seizes its prey with an appetite quickened rather than suppressed by its guilty vigils. American citizens are steeped up to their very mouths in this stream of iniquity. They throng to the coasts of Africa under the stained flags of Spain and Portugal, sometimes selling abroad their cargoes of despair, and sometimes bringing them into some of our southern ports, and there, under the forms of the law, defeating the purposes of the law itself and legalizing their inhuman but profitable adventures. And so this is just obviously you can't read it, a list, a database I've been developing of Maine vessels and Maine sailors and captains and merchants involved in the slave trade. And so this is where I have been compiling my research, which if you're interested in learning more, you can use this QR code if you know how to use a QR code, or you can go to this website, atlanticblackbox.com/art-in-the-wake- to view this list. And we've created some little narratives in each part under each vessel, so you can learn more about the vessel, who captained it, if there was resistance by enslaved people on board, etc. And thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about the